Hi, I'm Natalie Rodriguez. 3 months ago, I came home from a 12-hour shift to find my 6-year-old daughter, Sophie, locked in a bedroom closet, dehydrated and terrified, while my in-laws were getting massages at a luxury spa 2 hours away. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just an overworked mother they could torment. I was a licensed child welfare advocate with the power to destroy their perfect little world. And I did exactly that. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Oregon rain had been falling steadily for 3 days when I pulled into the driveway of our small craftsman house in the Hawthorne district. The windshield wipers squeaked against the glass as I sat for a moment, watching the droplets race down the windows. My phone showed 17 missed calls from David's mother, Patricia, and 12 from his father, Frank. That should have been my first warning. I'd been at the Northwest Children's Advocacy Center since dawn, working on a particularly difficult case involving a foster family that had been neglecting their placements. The irony wasn't lost on me now. I spent my days protecting other people's children while my own daughter was suffering under my own roof. The house felt wrong the moment I stepped inside. Too quiet. Sophie usually ran to greet me, her little arms wrapping around my legs as she chattered about her day at kindergarten. Instead, I was met with silence and the faint scent of Patricia's expensive perfume lingering in the air. "Sophie?" I called out, setting my work bag down by the door. "Baby girl, Mama's home?" Nothing. I walked through the living room, noting that the television was off and Sophie's toys were nowhere to be seen. Usually, the coffee table would be covered with her coloring books and crayons, evidence of an afternoon spent creating masterpieces for the refrigerator gallery. Today, the room looked sterile, almost staged. "Patricia? Frank?" I called louder, moving toward the kitchen. "Where is everyone?" The kitchen was spotless, which was unusual. Patricia prided herself on being helpful when she babysat, but she typically left evidence of her presence. Fancy teacups in the sink, expensive pastries on the counter, notes about Sophie's behavior written in her precise handwriting. Today, there was nothing. A cold dread began settling in my stomach as I climbed the stairs toward Sophie's bedroom. The hallway felt longer than usual, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet David's parents had insisted on installing when we bought the house. They'd paid for many improvements over the years, always with subtle reminders about how we couldn't afford such luxuries on my social worker's salary. "Sophie, sweetheart, where are you hiding?" I tried to keep my voice light, but panic was creeping in around the edges. That's when I heard it. A faint whimpering coming from behind Sophie's bedroom door. I pushed it open and scanned the room. Her bed was made with military precision, something Patricia always insisted on. The toys were organized in their bins. Everything looked perfect except for one thing. My daughter was nowhere to be seen. The whimpering came again, muffled and weak. My heart stopped as I realized it was coming from the closet. I rushed across the room and yanked open the closet door. Sophie was curled in the corner behind her hanging dresses, her knees pulled up to her chest, tear tracks staining her flushed cheeks. Her lips were dry and cracked, and when she saw me, she could barely manage a whisper. "Mama," she croaked, reaching her small arms toward me. I scooped her up immediately, feeling how light she seemed, how her little body trembled against mine. Her skin was warm, too warm, and I could see she'd been crying for hours. "Oh, baby girl, what happened? What are you doing in there?" I carried her to the bed, my hands shaking as I smoothed her tangled hair. "Grandma Patty said I was being naughty," Sophie whispered, her voice hoarse. "She said naughty girls don't get to play with toys or drink water until they learn to behave." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my professional training kick in, the same calm assessment mode I used when interviewing children who'd been hurt. But this wasn't someone else's child. This was my Sophie. "What did you do that Grandma Patty thought was naughty?" I asked gently, though every fiber of my being wanted to scream. "I asked for a snack," Sophie said, her brown eyes wide and confused. "And then I asked for some water, because I was thirsty. But Grandma Patty said I was being demanding, and that spoiled children don't deserve treats." I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. Sophie was the most polite 6-year-old I'd ever met, always saying please and thank you, always waiting to be offered food or drinks rather than demanding them. The idea that asking for water could be considered demanding was absurd. "How long were you in the closet, baby?" I asked, though I was already calculating in my head. I'd left for work at 6 in the morning. It was now past 7 in the evening. "Since after lunch," Sophie said. "Grandma Patty made me a peanut butter sandwich, but then she said I was eating too messy and took it away. When I asked for water, she put me in the closet." 13 hours. My 6-year-old daughter had been locked in a closet for 13 hours without water. I carried Sophie to the bathroom and helped her drink small sips of water, the way I'd been trained to help dehydrated children. Too much too fast could make her sick. She drank greedily, confirming what I already knew. She was severely dehydrated. "Where are Grandma Patty and Grandpa Frank now?" I asked as I wet a washcloth to clean her face. "They got dressed up pretty and said they were going to get massages," Sophie said. "Grandma Patty said I needed to think about my behavior while they were gone." My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it and felt my blood pressure spike. "Having a wonderful couple's day at Skamania Lodge Spa. Sophie was a little angel today. Hope work wasn't too stressful. We'll be back tomorrow morning. XOXO, Patricia." The text was accompanied by a photo of Patricia and Frank in plush spa robes, champagne glasses in hand, beaming at the camera. I stared at the phone, reading the message again. Sophie was a little angel today. While my daughter was locked in a closet, dehydrated and terrified, my mother-in-law was sipping champagne and getting Swedish massages. But Patricia had made a crucial mistake. She had no idea that I wasn't just Sophie's mother. I was a mandated reporter with over a decade of experience in child welfare. I knew exactly what constituted child abuse, and I had the professional connections to ensure this was handled properly. More importantly, she had no idea that I'd been documenting every slight, every cruel comment, every instance of emotional manipulation for the past 3 years. My supervisor at work, Carmen Delgado, had been encouraging me to take action for months. She'd seen the subtle changes in my behavior, the way I'd become quieter and more withdrawn after family gatherings. "Natalie, honey," Carmen had said just last week as we finished up a particularly difficult case, "you know you can't save every child, but you shouldn't have to save your own child from her grandparents." I'd laughed it off then, making excuses about cultural differences and generational parenting styles. But there was nothing cultural about locking a 6-year-old in a closet without water. There was nothing generational about emotional cruelty disguised as discipline. As I tucked Sophie into my bed, she was too scared to sleep in her own room. I made a decision. I pulled out my work laptop and began typing. Not a personal email or an angry text to my in-laws. I began filling out the official paperwork I knew by heart. Child Protective Services intake form. Case number pending. Reporter, Natalie Rodriguez. Licensed clinical social worker, Northwest Children's Advocacy Center. Child, Sophie Rodriguez, age 6 years, 4 months. Alleged perpetrators, Patricia Rodriguez and Frank Rodriguez, grandparents and temporary caregivers. I wrote everything down in clinical detail. The timeline. Sophie's physical condition when I found her. Her exact words about what had happened. The text message from Patricia. Everything documented with the precision I'd learned from years of building cases that would hold up in court. But I wasn't done. I also sent a message to Dr. Michael Harrison at OHSU Dornbitcher Children's Hospital, where I'd worked on cases involving medical neglect. I'd need Sophie examined and the dehydration documented. I sent another message to Detective Lisa Park, who specialized in child abuse cases. We'd collaborated on dozens of investigations over the years. What Patricia and Frank didn't understand was that their wealth and social standing in Portland's elite circles meant nothing when it came to child welfare law. I'd seen millionaires lose custody of their children. I'd watched respected community leaders face criminal charges for abuse. Money couldn't buy your way out of hurting a child, not when the system worked the way it was supposed to. As I worked through the night, documenting everything and setting the wheels in motion, I thought about all the times Patricia had made subtle digs about my profession.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Oh, Natalie, still trying to save the world one broken family at a time? She'd say with that practiced smile. It's so noble, even if it doesn't pay very well. She'd often commented on how David could have done better, how he'd married beneath his station by choosing a social worker over one of the lawyers or doctors in their social circle. She'd made jokes about my bleeding heart and my tendency to see abuse where there was just old-fashioned discipline. Frank was quieter, but equally dismissive. He'd nod along when Patricia spoke, occasionally adding comments about how children today were too soft, too coddled. He'd grown up in an era when children were seen and not heard, and he believed Sophie needed more structure, more consequences for her behavior. They'd never said anything overtly cruel in front of David. They were too smart for that. Instead, they'd wait for moments when he was out of the room, or they'd phrase their criticism as helpful suggestions. Maybe Sophie needs more boundaries, Patricia would say. Children crave structure, even if they resist it. The manipulation was subtle but constant. They'd undermine my parenting decisions by spoiling Sophie when David was around, then implementing harsh punishments when I wasn't there. They'd criticize my work schedule, suggesting that Sophie needed more stability, more time with family members who understood proper child rearing. What they didn't know was that I'd been taking notes, not because I planned to use them, but because my training had taught me to document patterns of behavior. It was instinctive at this point, the way other people might keep grocery lists or appointment calendars. I had records of every inappropriate comment, every undermining action, every instance where they'd crossed the line from grandparents offering advice to adults attempting to control and manipulate a child. I had dates, times, witnesses when possible. I'd even saved text messages and emails where they'd made concerning statements about discipline and child rearing. It was past 3 in the morning when I finally finished all the paperwork. Sophie was sleeping peacefully beside me, her breathing steady and deep. She'd drunk 2 full cups of water and eaten a small snack before falling asleep. The doctor would need to examine her in the morning, but she seemed to be recovering well from the dehydration. I looked at my phone and saw several more messages from Patricia and Frank. Photos from their spa day, updates about their dinner at the lodge's 5-star restaurant, comments about how they deserved this relaxation after, quote, dealing with challenging family situations. The last message, sent just an hour ago, made my stomach turn. Sophie is such a spirited child. Sometimes children need firm boundaries to help them learn respect. We hope you understand that discipline isn't always pleasant, but it's necessary for proper development. They were already trying to control the narrative, to frame what they'd done as necessary discipline rather than abuse. They probably expected me to be grateful for their help with Sophie's behavior. They certainly didn't expect me to fight back. But they'd forgotten something important about my profession. I didn't just advocate for children, I fought for them. I'd gone up against parents, relatives, teachers, coaches, anyone who thought they could hurt a child and get away with it. I'd testified in court, faced down hostile attorneys, stared down abusers who thought their money or status would protect them. Patricia and Frank were about to learn that their daughter-in-law wasn't the pushover they thought she was. They were about to discover that hurting Sophie meant going to war with someone who knew exactly how to win that kind of fight. As the first hints of dawn began to creep through the curtains, I sent one final message. This one went to my supervisor, Carmen, marked urgent. Need to request emergency family leave. Sophie was abused by David's parents yesterday while in their care. Have documented everything and initiated CPS report. We'll need support navigating conflict of interest protocols, since this involves my own family. Please call when you get this. I turned off the phone and pulled Sophie closer to me. She stirred slightly in her sleep, her small hand reaching out to grip my arm. Even unconscious, she was making sure I was still there, still protecting her. Tomorrow, Patricia and Frank would return from their spa weekend expecting to find a grateful daughter-in-law and a properly chastened granddaughter. Instead, they were going to find out what happened when you hurt the child of someone who devoted her entire career to protecting children from people exactly like them. The rain had stopped. and weak morning sunlight was beginning to filter through the windows. It was going to be a beautiful day for justice. I woke up to Sophie's small voice whispering my name. The morning light streaming through our bedroom window revealed the dark circles under her eyes, evidence of a restless night filled with dreams about closets and locked doors. She'd woken up 3 times, each time reaching out to make sure I was still beside her. "Mama, are Grandma Patty and Grandpa Frank coming back today?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Yes, baby girl, but things are going to be different this time," I said, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "Mama's going to make sure you're safe." The first call came at 7:30 in the morning. Dr. Harrison had reviewed my message and agreed to see Sophie immediately. No questions asked, no lengthy explanations required. That was the benefit of years of professional relationships built on trust and mutual respect. "Bring her in through the staff entrance," he'd said. "We'll get her examined and documented properly. You know the drill, Natalie. This needs to be by the book." The second call came from Detective Lisa Park. She'd worked enough cases with me to know I didn't cry wolf, didn't exaggerate situations for dramatic effect. When I said a child had been abused, she listened. "I'll need to interview Sophie today," Lisa said, her voice gentle but professional. "Child Advocacy Center. Neutral environment. Can you have her there by noon?" "Already planned on it," I replied. "Lisa, there's something else you should know. The perpetrators are my in-laws. They're wealthy, well-connected in the community. Frank Rodriguez sits on the board of 3 different charities. Patricia volunteers with the Symphony Association." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Natalie, you know that doesn't matter to me. Rich people abuse children too. Sometimes they're worse, because they think their money makes them untouchable." The third call was the hardest one to make. David was in Seattle for a medical conference, presenting research on pediatric emergency medicine. We'd been married for 8 years, and in all that time, I'd never had to tell him that his parents had hurt our daughter. "What do you mean she was locked in a closet?" His voice cracked over the phone connection. "That doesn't sound like something my parents would do." I closed my eyes, hearing the disbelief in his voice. This was the part I'd been dreading. David loved his parents, trusted them implicitly. They'd raised him to be successful, driven, compassionate in his work as a doctor. The idea that they could be cruel to Sophie would challenge everything he believed about them. "David, I found her dehydrated and terrified. She'd been in there for 13 hours without water. Your parents were at a spa, sending me photos of their champagne and massages." "There has to be an explanation," he said, but I could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. Maybe Sophie misunderstood. Maybe she was playing hide and seek and got scared. "She asked for water, David. She asked for a snack. Your mother locked her in a closet as punishment for being thirsty." The silence stretched between us, filled with years of unspoken tensions and carefully avoided confrontations. I'd tried to talk to David about his parents' behavior before, but he'd always found ways to excuse or rationalize their actions. They were old-fashioned, he'd say. They meant well. They just wanted what was best for Sophie. "I'm coming home," he said finally. "Don't do anything until I get there. Please, Natalie." "Let me talk to them first." "It's too late for talking, David. I've already filed the CPS report. Sophie has a medical appointment in an hour, and Detective Park will be interviewing her this afternoon." "You what?" His voice rose to a pitch I'd never heard before. "Natalie, these are my parents. You can't just report them like they're strangers off the street." "I reported them because they abused our daughter," I said, my voice steady despite the pain in my chest. "That's what I do when children are hurt. That's what you'd want me to do if it was any other child. But it's not any other child. It's Sophie, and they're my parents." "Exactly, it's Sophie, our daughter, and your parents hurt her." I hung up before he could argue further. This was the conversation I'd been dreading for years, the moment when David would have to choose between his parents and his family. I'd hoped it would never come to this, but Patricia and Frank had forced the issue. At the hospital, Dr. Harrison's examination confirmed what I already knew. Sophie was clinically dehydrated, showing signs of mild heat exhaustion from being confined in a small, poorly ventilated space for an extended period. Her blood pressure was elevated, consistent with stress and anxiety. She had small bruises on her wrists where she'd tried to push open the closet door. "This is clear evidence of neglect," Dr. Harrison said, as he completed his documentation. "Withholding water from a child for 13 hours constitutes medical neglect at minimum. The psychological trauma of confinement could have long-lasting effects." Sophie sat quietly during the examination, answering the doctor's questions in her polite, careful way. She described what had happened without embellishment or dramatic flourishes, just the simple truth told in a 6-year-old's words. It was heartbreaking in its matter-of-fact delivery. "Grandma Patty said I was being spoiled," Sophie told Dr. Harrison. "She said spoiled children don't deserve water until they learn to be grateful." I watched the doctor's jaw tighten as he wrote down her words. He'd examined hundreds of abused children over his career, but there was something particularly disturbing about grandparents using basic necessities as weapons against their own grandchild. The interview with Detective Park went smoothly. The Child Advocacy Center had been designed specifically for these situations, with comfortable furniture, soft lighting, and toys to help children feel safe. Sophie sat in a small chair next to a dollhouse, occasionally moving the tiny figures around as she talked. "Can you tell me about yesterday when your mama was at work?" Detective Park asked, her voice warm and encouraging. Sophie described the day in chronological order, starting with Patricia making her a peanut butter sandwich for lunch. She'd been excited about the sandwich because Patricia usually made fancy foods that Sophie didn't like. But when Sophie ate the sandwich with her hands instead of cutting it into small pieces first, Patricia had become angry. "She said I was eating like an animal," Sophie said, moving a small doll into the dollhouse kitchen. "She took the sandwich away and said I didn't deserve to finish it if I couldn't eat properly." "What happened next?" Detective Park asked. "I got thirsty because the peanut butter was sticky in my mouth. I asked for some water, but Grandma Patty said I was being demanding. She said good children wait to be offered drinks instead of asking for them." The story continued with Sophie asking again for water about an hour later. This time, Patricia had become furious, lecturing Sophie about gratitude and respect. When Sophie started to cry, Patricia had grabbed her by the arm and marched her upstairs to the closet. "She said I needed to think about my behavior," Sophie said, her voice getting smaller. "She said when children act spoiled, they lose privileges. She said water was a privilege, not a right." Detective Park's pen moved steadily across her notepad, recording every detail. I could see the anger in her eyes, carefully controlled but definitely present. She'd heard countless stories of child abuse, but the calculated cruelty of Patricia's actions was particularly disturbing. "Did Grandpa Frank know you were in the closet?" Detective Park asked. "He helped Grandma Patty get ready for the spa," Sophie said. "He said I should listen to Grandma Patty and learn my lesson." So Frank had known. He'd participated in the decision to leave Sophie locked in the closet while they went to enjoy massages and champagne. This wasn't a case of one grandparent losing control while the other was unaware. This was a deliberate, coordinated decision by both of them. After the interview, Detective Park walked me to the parking lot. Her expression was grim, professional mask slipping slightly to reveal her personal feelings about the case. "Natalie, I've got to ask, are you prepared for the backlash? People like your in-laws don't go down quietly. They'll hire expensive lawyers, they'll call in favors, they'll try to make you look like an unfit mother who's fabricating stories." I'd been thinking about this all morning. Patricia and Frank had money, connections, social standing in Portland's elite community. Frank's law firm handled cases for half the city's major businesses. Patricia sat on boards with judges, wives and city council members, spouses. They could make life very difficult for us. "I'm prepared," I said. "But more importantly, I'm right. They hurt Sophie, and I have the evidence to prove it." "What about David? Is he going to support you or his parents?" That was the question I'd been avoiding all day. "David was a good man, a loving father, a dedicated doctor who devoted his life to helping children. But he was also a son who'd been raised to respect and honor his parents no matter what. I don't know, I admitted, but I can't protect his relationship with his parents at Sophie's expense. If I have to choose between keeping the peace and keeping Sophie safe, there's no choice at all. Detective Park nodded. Good. Because this is going to get ugly before it gets better. I drove home with Sophie sleeping in the back seat, exhausted from the emotional stress of the morning. As we pulled into our driveway, I saw Patricia's white Mercedes parked on the street. They were back from their spa weekend, probably expecting to resume their normal routine of subtle manipulation and emotional abuse. But I wasn't the same woman who'd left for work yesterday morning. I wasn't the daughter-in-law who'd spent 3 years walking on eggshells, making excuses for their behavior, trying to keep the peace for David's sake. I was a mother whose child had been hurt, and I was a professional who knew exactly how to fight this battle. I carried Sophie inside, noting that Patricia and Frank were sitting in our living room, as if they owned the place. They'd let themselves in with the spare key we'd given them for emergencies, making themselves comfortable on our couch, helping themselves to coffee from our kitchen. "Oh good, you're home," Patricia said with her practiced smile. "We were worried when we couldn't reach David this morning. How was Sophie's day?" We hoped she had time to think about her behavior yesterday. I stared at her for a long moment, this woman who'd raised my husband, who'd been present at our wedding, who'd held Sophie as a newborn. She looked perfectly put together as always, not a hair out of place, makeup applied with professional precision. There was no guilt in her expression, no awareness that she'd done anything wrong. Sophie's day was spent being examined by a doctor and interviewed by a detective. I said calmly, "She's been medically cleared, but the psychological trauma will take longer to heal." Patricia's smile faltered slightly. "I'm sorry, what? Why would Sophie need to see a doctor?" "Because she was dehydrated from being locked in a closet for 13 hours without water," I said, my voice steady and professional, "which constitutes child abuse under Oregon state law." Frank stood up from the couch, his face reddening. "Now see here, Natalie. I don't appreciate your tone. We were providing discipline for a child who was acting out. If you'd teach her proper manners, we wouldn't need to step in. You locked a 6-year-old in a closet because she asked for water," I said, not raising my voice. "Then you went to a spa and posted photos on social media while she was trapped and scared." "Children need boundaries," Patricia said, her voice taking on that condescending tone I'd heard so many times before. Sophie was being demanding and disrespectful. We simply gave her time to think about her actions. "You denied her water for 13 hours. You confined her in a small space against her will. You left her alone and terrified while you enjoyed massages and champagne." I pulled out my phone and showed them the text message they'd sent. "You bragged about how she was such a little angel while she was locked in a closet." Patricia's face went pale as she read her own words. "That's not. I didn't mean. You meant exactly what you wrote. You enjoyed punishing her. You got satisfaction from teaching her a lesson about knowing her place." Frank stepped forward, his voice rising. "We don't have to stand here and listen to these accusations from someone who clearly doesn't understand proper child rearing." Sophie was being defiant, and we corrected her behavior. End of story. "Actually, it's just the beginning of the story," I said, "because I've filed a formal complaint with Child Protective Services. Detective Lisa Park has opened an investigation. Dr. Michael Harrison has documented Sophie's injuries and dehydration. This isn't a family disagreement anymore. This is a criminal matter." The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Frank's face cycled through several colors, settling on an angry purple. "You reported us," Patricia whispered. "To the authorities? We're family, Natalie. You handle family matters within the family." "You stopped being family the moment you hurt my daughter," I said. "And I handle child abuse the way I always handle it. Through proper legal channels." Frank's voice was shaking with rage. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The embarrassment you've caused? The damage to our reputation?" "I have a law practice. Patricia sits on charity boards. This kind of scandal could ruin us." You should have thought about that before you abused Sophie. We didn't abuse anyone, Patricia shrieked, her careful composure finally cracking. We provided discipline. We taught her respect. You're the one who's ruined everything with your bleeding heart liberal nonsense. I'm the one who protected my daughter from people who think denying water to a 6-year-old is appropriate discipline. That's when David walked through the front door. He looked exhausted from the drive from Seattle, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his tie loosened around his neck. He took in the scene. His parents standing stiffly in our living room, me holding Sophie protectively against my chest, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "What's going on here?" he asked, though his voice suggested he already knew this conversation wasn't going to end well. "Your wife has lost her mind," Frank said immediately. "She's reported us to Child Services over a simple disciplinary action. She's trying to destroy our family over nothing." David looked at me, his eyes pleading for some kind of explanation that would make this all go away. "Natalie, please tell me you haven't actually filed a formal complaint." "I filed a complaint because your parents abused Sophie," I said. "I did exactly what any mandated reporter would do when presented with evidence of child abuse." "It wasn't abuse," Patricia said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "David, sweetheart, you know we love Sophie. We were just trying to teach her proper behavior. Children today are so spoiled, so entitled. We were helping her learn respect." David ran his hands through his hair, looking back and forth between his parents and his wife. "There has to be a misunderstanding here. Mom, Dad, what exactly happened yesterday?" Frank launched into a detailed explanation that painted Sophie as a defiant, disrespectful child who'd refused to follow simple rules about proper eating etiquette. According to his version, they'd given her multiple chances to correct her behavior before reluctantly implementing consequences. "She was being deliberately provocative," Patricia added, "eating with her hands like an animal, demanding food and water like we were servants. We simply gave her time to think about how her actions affect others." "You locked her in a closet for 13 hours, I said flatly, "without water, while you went to a spa." David closed his eyes. "Mom, is that true? Did you actually lock Sophie in a closet?" "We gave her a timeout in a quiet space where she could reflect on her behavior," Patricia said carefully. "The closet is perfectly safe. She had air, she had space to sit down. It's not like we threw her in a dungeon." "For 13 hours, without water?" "Children don't need constant access to food and drinks," Frank said defensively. "In my day, children ate at mealtimes and drank when offered. This constant snacking and drinking whenever they want is what creates entitled brats." I watched David process this information, saw the moment when he realized his parents had actually done what I'd accused them of. His face went through several expressions: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally, a deep sadness that broke my heart. "She's 6 years old," he said quietly. "She asked for water, and you locked her in a closet." "David, you're not understanding the full context," Patricia said, reaching for his arm. "Sophie has been developing some concerning behaviors. She's becoming demanding, entitled. We were nipping it in the bud before it became a bigger problem." "She asked for water," David repeated, his voice getting stronger. "My daughter asked for water, and you locked her in a closet and went to get massages." The fight that followed was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. David, who'd spent his entire life respecting and honoring his parents, finally saw them clearly. Patricia tried tears, manipulation, guilt trips about how much they'd sacrificed for the family. Frank tried intimidation, threats about legal consequences and family loyalty. But David had seen Sophie's medical report. He'd heard Detective Park's preliminary findings. He'd looked into his daughter's eyes and seen the fear that his parents had put there. "You need to leave," he said finally, his voice hollow. "You need to leave our house and stay away from Sophie until this investigation is complete." "David, you can't be serious," Patricia pleaded. "We're your parents. We love you, we love Sophie. This is all a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion." "You hurt my daughter," David said, and I could hear years of conditioning breaking in his voice. "You hurt Sophie, and then you lied about it. You're not welcome here anymore." Frank's face turned red again. You're going to regret this, son. You're going to regret choosing that woman over your own family. We've done everything for you, sacrificed everything to give you opportunities, and this is how you repay us? You locked my 6-year-old daughter in a closet, David said, his voice rising. You denied her water for 13 hours while you got spa treatments. How exactly am I supposed to repay that? We were trying to help, Patricia sobbed. We were trying to teach her proper behavior before it was too late. You don't understand how difficult children can be when they're not given proper boundaries. Get out, David said, pointing toward the door. Get out of our house and don't come back. After they left, David collapsed onto the couch and put his head in his hands. Sophie had fallen asleep during the confrontation, exhausted by the emotional upheaval of the past 24 hours. I laid her down on the couch next to David and covered her with her favorite blanket. I'm sorry, David said without looking up. I should have seen it sooner. I should have protected her from them. You couldn't have known they were capable of this, I said, sitting down beside him. Yes, I could have. I did know, somewhere deep down. I knew they were critical of her, demanding in ways that weren't appropriate. I just told myself they meant well, that they were old-fashioned but harmless. We sat in silence for a while, watching Sophie sleep peacefully for the first time in 24 hours. Her breathing was steady, her color good, the fear finally gone from her expression. What happens now? David asked. Now we wait for the investigation to run its course. CPS will interview us, interview Sophie again, probably interview your parents. There might be criminal charges, depending on what the DA decides. And us? Our marriage? Our family? I looked at my husband, this man I'd loved for 8 years, who'd just chosen his daughter over his parents despite a lifetime of conditioning. We protect Sophie. We get her counseling to help her process what happened. We make sure she knows she's safe and loved. And my parents? That's up to them. If they accept responsibility, get counseling, demonstrate genuine change, maybe someday there could be supervised visits. But Sophie's safety comes first. Always. David nodded, reaching over to smooth Sophie's hair. I keep thinking about all the times they criticized your parenting. All the suggestions about discipline and structure. Were they building up to this? Testing boundaries? I'd been wondering the same thing. Looking back, there had been signs. Comments about modern children being too soft. Stories about how discipline used to be handled in their generation. Subtle criticism of my approach to parenting. I think they've been escalating for a while, I said. Testing to see how much they could get away with. How far they could push before we pushed back. Why didn't I see it? Because they raised you to trust them, to assume they always had good intentions. It's hard to believe people you love are capable of cruelty. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and paperwork. The CPS investigation moved quickly, helped by my professional reputation and the clear evidence of abuse. Detective Park interviewed Patricia and Frank separately, and their stories began to fall apart under scrutiny. Patricia tried to maintain that Sophie had been defiant and needed discipline, but she couldn't explain why water had to be withheld, or why 13 hours was an appropriate length of time for a timeout. Frank became defensive and hostile, making statements that only strengthened the case against them. That child has been spoiled rotten by her mother, he told Detective Park. She needed to learn that actions have consequences. If Natalie had done her job as a parent, we wouldn't have needed to step in. The investigation also revealed a pattern of concerning behavior that went back months. Sophie's kindergarten teacher, when interviewed, mentioned that Sophie had become more anxious and withdrawn after spending time with her grandparents. She'd started hoarding snacks in her backpack, apparently worried about not having food available when she was hungry. Our pediatrician noted that Sophie had lost weight over the past few months, despite being in a normal growth phase. When asked about her eating habits, Sophie revealed that Patricia often criticized her appetite, calling her greedy for asking for seconds or snacks between meals. The picture that emerged was of systematic emotional abuse disguised as old-fashioned discipline. Patricia and Frank had been gradually increasing their control over Sophie, using food, water, and basic comfort as tools of manipulation. The breaking point came when Carmen, my supervisor at work, called with an update from the CPS investigation. "Natalie, you need to know that Patricia contacted our agency yesterday. She tried to file a complaint against you, claiming you were an unfit mother who was fabricating abuse allegations to cover your own neglect." I felt my stomach drop. I'd expected them to fight back, but I hadn't expected them to try to turn the investigation around on me. She claimed that Sophie's behavioral problems were the result of inconsistent parenting and lack of proper discipline at home. She said you were too permissive, that Sophie had been acting out because she craved structure and boundaries. What did the investigator say? That Patricia Rodriguez appeared to be attempting to manipulate the system to deflect from her own actions. The investigator noted that Patricia seemed more concerned with avoiding consequences than with Sophie's well-being. It was a relief, but also a wake-up call. Patricia and Frank weren't going to accept responsibility quietly. They were going to fight this investigation with everything they had, regardless of how it affected Sophie or our family. That evening, as I was making dinner, David came home with news that changed everything. "I talked to my dad's law partner today," he said, setting down his medical bag. "Apparently, my parents have hired a criminal defense attorney. They're claiming the whole thing is a conspiracy between you and your colleagues to frame them." "A conspiracy?" "They're saying you hold grudges against them for not approving of our marriage, that you've been looking for an excuse to exclude them from Sophie's life. They're going to argue that you coached Sophie to lie about what happened." I felt something cold settle in my chest. This was exactly what Detective Park had warned me about. Wealthy, well-connected people didn't accept accountability. They hired expensive lawyers and tried to destroy their accusers. "There's more," David said, his voice grim. "They've hired a private investigator to look into your background, your work history, your mental health. They're building a case that you're an unstable person who's using your professional position to wage a personal vendetta." The war had officially begun. Over the next week, the attacks escalated. Patricia and Frank's attorney sent letters to my workplace, questioning my professional judgment and suggesting that I'd violated ethical boundaries by investigating my own family members. They demanded copies of all my case files, looking for evidence of bias or misconduct. They hired a child psychologist who specialized in false memory syndrome, preparing to argue that Sophie had been led to create false memories of abuse. They gathered character witnesses who would testify to their outstanding reputations in the community. But they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd underestimated my professional network and the strength of the evidence against them. Carmen rallied our entire agency behind me. She reached out to colleagues across the state, building a coalition of child welfare professionals who were willing to testify about my competence and integrity. Dr. Harrison provided detailed medical documentation that couldn't be disputed. Detective Park's investigation had uncovered additional evidence, including security camera footage from their apartment building that showed them leaving for the spa while Sophie was locked in the closet. Most importantly, Sophie herself remained consistent in her account of what had happened. Despite multiple interviews by different professionals, her story never changed. She described the events in age-appropriate language, with emotional responses that were entirely consistent with trauma. The child psychologist hired by Patricia and Frank interviewed Sophie and concluded that her memories were genuine, not implanted or coached. This was a devastating blow to their defense strategy. 3 weeks after the initial incident, I received a call that I'd been expecting but dreading. "Mrs. Rodriguez, this is District Attorney Jennifer Walsh. I wanted to inform you personally that we'll be filing formal charges against Patricia and Frank Rodriguez. They're being charged with child endangerment, criminal mistreatment, and unlawful imprisonment." The relief was overwhelming. It meant that Sophie's account had been believed, that the evidence was strong enough to convince prosecutors that a crime had been committed. "What happens next?" I asked. "There will be arraignments, probably plea negotiations. Their attorneys will likely try to work out a deal that avoids jail time in exchange for admitting responsibility. But I want you to know that we're taking this seriously. What they did to Sophie was unconscionable. That evening, David and I sat down with Sophie to explain what was happening in age-appropriate terms. We told her that the police and judges agreed that what Grandma Patty and Grandpa Frank had done was wrong, that she hadn't done anything bad, and that we were making sure it would never happen again. "Are they going to jail?" Sophie asked, her 6-year-old understanding of justice fairly straightforward. "They might," David said carefully. "But the most important thing is that they can't hurt you anymore. Mama and Daddy are going to make sure you're always safe." Sophie nodded solemnly, then went back to coloring in her princess coloring book. She'd been in therapy for 2 weeks, working with a specialist who helped children process trauma. The therapist said Sophie was resilient, that with proper support she would likely recover fully from the experience. 2 days later, Patricia called me directly. "Natalie, please, we need to talk. This whole situation has gotten completely out of hand. Surely we can work something out without involving lawyers and courts." I'd been expecting this call. Now that they were facing real consequences, Patricia and Frank wanted to negotiate. They wanted to avoid the public humiliation of a trial, the permanent stain on their reputations. "There's nothing to work out, Patricia. You hurt Sophie, and now you're facing the consequences." "We made a mistake," she said, and for the first time I heard something that might have been genuine remorse in her voice. "We were trying to help, but we went too far. Can't we handle this as a family? You had the chance to handle this as a family. Instead, you locked a 6-year-old in a closet and went to get massages. Please, Natalie, we're begging you. We'll do anything. Counseling, supervised visits, whatever you want. Just don't let this destroy our family. You destroyed the family when you hurt Sophie. I'm just making sure she's protected from it happening again." I hung up the phone and found David standing in the doorway, having overheard the conversation. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Sad," I said honestly. "I'm sad that it came to this. I'm sad that Sophie had to be hurt for them to face consequences. I'm sad that you lost your parents." "I didn't lose my parents," David said, pulling me into his arms. "I discovered who they really were. There's a difference." The legal proceedings moved forward over the next several months. Patricia and Frank's high-powered attorneys tried every tactic they could think of, but the evidence was overwhelming. Eventually, faced with the prospect of a public trial that would expose all the details of their behavior, they accepted a plea agreement. They were sentenced to 2 years of probation, mandatory counseling, and community service at a children's charity. They were prohibited from having any contact with Sophie without court supervision. The conviction would remain on their records permanently. More importantly for our family, the ordeal had fundamentally changed our dynamics. David was no longer caught between loyalty to his parents and protection of his daughter. He'd seen clearly who they were and what they were capable of, and he'd chosen Sophie without hesitation. 6 months after that terrible day when I found Sophie in the closet, we were finally beginning to heal. Sophie was thriving in therapy, her natural resilience asserting itself as she processed what had happened. She still had occasional nightmares, still sometimes asked for extra water at bedtime, as if making sure it would always be available. But she was laughing again, playing with her friends, excited about starting 1st grade in the fall. The fear was fading, replaced by the confidence that comes from knowing your parents will always protect you. As for me, the experience had changed my perspective on everything. I'd always fought for other people's children, but I'd never had to fight for my own. The intensity of that protective instinct, the clarity it brought about what really mattered, had been both terrifying and empowering. I'd learned that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who can hurt you the deepest. I'd learned that wealth and social standing mean nothing when it comes to basic human decency. Most importantly, I'd learned that my professional skills weren't just tools for helping strangers. They were weapons I could use to protect my own family when necessary. Standing in Sophie's bedroom one evening, watching her sleep peacefully in her own bed, I reflected on how far we'd come. The closet door stood open, as it had every night since the incident. Sophie had asked us to leave it open, and we'd agreed without question. She stirred slightly in her sleep, reaching out as she often did to make sure her water cup was still on the nightstand. Finding it there, she settled back into peaceful dreams. David appeared beside me, wrapping his arms around my waist as we watched our daughter sleep. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. I thought about the question seriously. The past 6 months had been the most difficult of our marriage. We'd faced public scrutiny, family destruction, legal battles, and emotional trauma. David had lost his relationship with his parents, probably permanently. Our extended family had been divided, with some relatives supporting us and others believing Patricia and Frank's version of events. But Sophie was safe. She was healing. She knew without doubt that her parents would protect her from anyone who tried to hurt her, even if those people were supposed to love her. "No regrets," I said softly. "Not a single one." Outside Sophie's window, Portland's city lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the community that had rallied around us during the darkest time. The Child Advocacy Center where I worked, the hospital where David practiced, the school where Sophie would start first grade, all of them had supported us, believed in us, helped us fight for what was right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as every day did when you were raising a child in an uncomplicated world. But tonight, Sophie was safe in her own bed, with water on her nightstand, and parents who would never let anyone hurt her again. That was enough. That was everything. The morning after Patricia and Frank's dramatic exit from our home, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring at the stack of documents spread before me. Each page represented years of careful observation, meticulous note-taking, and professional instincts that I'd tried to suppress in the name of family harmony. But harmony built on the foundation of a child suffering wasn't harmony at all. It was complicity. The first document in the stack was dated 18 months ago, when Sophie had started having nightmares after spending a weekend with her grandparents. She'd woken up crying, saying she'd dreamed about being locked in a dark room where no one could hear her calling for help. At the time, I'd dismissed it as typical childhood anxiety, maybe triggered by a scary movie or story. Now, looking at that incident report I'd written out of habit, I could see the pattern beginning to emerge. Patricia and Frank hadn't suddenly decided to lock Sophie in a closet. They'd been building toward this moment, testing boundaries, escalating their control tactics gradually enough that each individual incident seemed manageable. The second document detailed Sophie's increased anxiety around mealtimes when her grandparents were present. She'd started eating faster, sometimes to the point of making herself sick and hoarding snacks in her bedroom. When I'd asked her about it, she'd said Grandpa Frank told her that children who didn't finish their food quickly were being wasteful and selfish. I remembered confronting Frank about this, gently suggesting that Sophie needed more time to eat properly. His response had been dismissive, almost condescending. "Children need structure, Natalie. In my day, we ate what was put in front of us when it was put in front of us. This business of catering to every whim is what creates entitled brats." David had supported his father then, suggesting that maybe Frank had a point about consistency and structure. I'd backed down, not wanting to create family conflict over what seemed like a minor issue. But it wasn't minor to Sophie, who'd internalized the message that her basic needs were somehow selfish impositions. The third document chronicled the time Patricia had made Sophie stand in the corner for 2 hours, because she'd used the wrong fork at dinner. Sophie had been 4 years old, barely able to remember which utensil to use for which course, but Patricia had insisted that proper table manners were essential for developing character. "She needs to learn that details matter," Patricia had explained when I'd quietly suggested that the punishment was excessive. "Sloppy habits in childhood become character flaws in adulthood. I'm helping her develop discipline and attention to detail." I'd watched my 4-year-old daughter stand motionless in that corner, tears streaming down her face, too scared to move or speak because Grandma Patty had said that any sound or movement would reset the timer. David had been at the hospital that evening, dealing with an emergency, so it had been just Patricia, Frank, Sophie, and me. When I'd tried to intervene, suggesting that Sophie had learned her lesson, Frank had stepped in with quiet authority. "Patricia is handling this appropriately, Natalie. Sophie needs to understand that actions have consequences. If you interrupt the discipline process, you're teaching her that she can manipulate adults to avoid accountability." So I'd sat there, watching my baby suffer through what amounted to psychological torture, because I'd been gaslit into believing that my maternal instincts were wrong, and their expertise in child rearing was superior to my professional training in child development. The fourth document was perhaps the most damning, because it showed how they'd begun isolating Sophie from sources of comfort and support. They'd convinced David that Sophie was becoming too dependent on me, that she needed to learn independence and self-reliance. Their solution was to prohibit Sophie from seeking comfort when she was upset. "Crying is manipulation," Patricia had declared after Sophie had fallen and scraped her knee during a family barbecue. "If you comfort her every time she sheds a tear, you're teaching her that emotions can be used as weapons to control other people." When Sophie had reached for me, crying and holding her bleeding knee, Patricia had physically blocked her path. "Sophie, you're fine. Stop crying immediately and go wash your knee in the bathroom. If you can't handle a minor scrape without making a scene, maybe you're not ready for big girl activities." Sophie had looked at me with desperate eyes, clearly wanting her mother's comfort, but I'd been so thoroughly convinced that I was overprotective, so afraid of undermining Patricia's authority, that I'd stood there and let my 5-year-old daughter handle her pain alone. The memory made me physically sick now. How had I allowed myself to be manipulated into abandoning my child when she needed me most? How had I let Patricia and Frank convince me that basic maternal responses were harmful to Sophie's development? But I knew how. They'd been systematic and strategic, using my love for David and my desire to maintain family relationships as weapons against my parental instincts. They'd positioned themselves as the experts, the ones with experience and wisdom, while painting me as an over-emotional novice who needed guidance to avoid ruining Sophie with excessive affection. The fifth document showed how they'd begun controlling Sophie's access to basic necessities as a form of behavior modification. They'd instituted a rule that Sophie had to earn snacks and drinks through good behavior, defining good behavior as complete compliance with their increasingly arbitrary demands. Sophie had to sit with perfect posture for 30 minutes before earning a cup of water. She had to recite her alphabet backwards before being allowed a snack. She had to stand perfectly still while Patricia inspected her appearance, correcting any perceived flaws in her clothing or grooming before she could eat dinner. Each requirement was presented as a lesson in discipline and self-control. Children who can't regulate their own behavior need external structure until they develop internal motivation. Frank had explained when I'd questioned why Sophie needed to jump through hoops for basic necessities. I'd researched their claims, wanting to understand if this was indeed a legitimate parenting philosophy. What I'd found was that these were classic techniques used by abusers to establish dominance and control. The gradual escalation, the arbitrary rules, the framing of abuse as necessary discipline. It was all textbook psychological manipulation. But by the time I'd recognized the pattern, I felt trapped. David genuinely believed his parents were helping Sophie develop character and resilience. Our extended family had been convinced that I was overprotective, and that Patricia and Frank's old-fashioned approach was beneficial. I'd begun to doubt my own perceptions, wondering if my professional training was making me oversensitive to normal generational differences in parenting styles. The sixth document detailed the incident that should have been my wake-up call, 6 months before the closet imprisonment. Patricia had forced Sophie to sit alone at the dinner table for 3 hours because she'd asked for seconds before finishing everything on her plate. Sophie had been so hungry that she'd eaten the cold, congealed food with tears streaming down her face, while Patricia sat nearby reading a magazine and commenting on how important it was for children to learn patience and gratitude. When David came home and found Sophie still sitting at the table at 9 o'clock at night, he'd been concerned but not alarmed. Patricia had explained that Sophie was learning valuable lessons about self-control and respect for food. She'd framed it as a teaching moment about world hunger and the importance of finishing what you're given before asking for more. "Maybe she's right," David had said later as we'd gotten ready for bed. "Sophie does seem to have gotten into the habit of asking for more food before she's finished what she has. It's probably good for her to learn to be more mindful about eating." I'd wanted to scream that sitting alone at a table for 3 hours wasn't mindfulness training. It was punishment designed to break a child's spirit. But I'd held my tongue, afraid of being labeled as dramatic or overprotective. Now, reviewing all these documents, I could see clearly how Patricia and Frank had systematically groomed our entire family to accept escalating levels of abuse. They'd started with minor boundary violations, then gradually increased the severity while framing each escalation as necessary for Sophie's development. They'd isolated Sophie from sources of comfort and support, convinced the adults around her that seeking help was manipulation, and established themselves as the ultimate authorities on appropriate child rearing. By the time they'd locked her in that closet, they'd already conditioned everyone to view their cruelty as expertise. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that I would continue to prioritize family harmony over my daughter's well-being indefinitely. They'd gotten so comfortable with their control that they'd stopped being careful about covering their tracks. The text message about Sophie being such a little angel while she was locked in a closet wasn't just evidence of their crime, it was proof of their arrogance. They'd genuinely believed that they could abuse a child and then brag about their lovely spa day without consequences. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the photos they'd posted on social media during their weekend at Skamania Lodge. Patricia in her plush bathrobe, champagne glass raised in a toast. Frank getting a hot stone massage, eyes closed in blissful relaxation. A sunset dinner at the lodge's 5-star restaurant, complete with wine pairings and elaborate presentations. Every image was time-stamped, creating a precise record of their activities while Sophie was imprisoned in our home. They documented their own callousness, creating evidence that would be impossible to explain away in court. But the photos also revealed something else. They genuinely enjoyed themselves while Sophie suffered. This wasn't a case of grandparents who'd made a mistake in judgment or lost their tempers. They'd planned this punishment, executed it deliberately, and then celebrated their power over a 6-year-old child. My phone rang, interrupting my review of the evidence. Carmen's name appeared on the screen, and I answered immediately. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice warm with concern and professional understanding. "Better than I expected," I said honestly. "I've been going through my documentation from the past 2 years, and the pattern is clear. This wasn't an isolated incident. I figured as much. In my experience, people don't just wake up one day and decide to lock a child in a closet. There's usually a history of escalating control behaviors. Carmen had been my supervisor for 5 years, and in that time we'd worked hundreds of cases involving family abuse. She'd seen every variation of manipulation, control, and violence that humans could inflict on children. Her validation of my concerns meant more than any legal vindication could. "Carmen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have I been compromised in this situation? Have I let my personal relationships cloud my professional judgment?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear Carmen choosing her words carefully. "Natalie, in the 5 years I've supervised your casework, you've never once overreacted to a situation. If anything, you've erred on the side of giving families too much benefit of the doubt. You've advocated for family preservation in cases where other workers would have recommended removal. You've fought for resources and support services for families that other people had written off." She paused, then continued with more emphasis. "The fact that you're questioning your own judgment right now tells me that you've been psychologically manipulated. Healthy people don't doubt their perceptions when they discover evidence of child abuse. Victims of gaslighting do." The relief I felt at her words was overwhelming. For months I'd been questioning my own reality, wondering if my training and instincts were making me oversensitive to normal family dynamics. Hearing Carmen confirm that my concerns were valid felt like being given permission to trust myself again. "What's the status of the investigation?" I asked. "CPS has assigned their most experienced investigator, Maria Santos. She's reviewed all your documentation and conducted preliminary interviews with Dr. Harrison and Detective Park. Her initial assessment is that this is a clear case of child abuse with evidence of systematic psychological manipulation of the family system." What does that mean in practical terms? It means that the investigator recognizes this isn't just about one incident of poor judgment. She's looking at the broader pattern of behavior and how Patricia and Frank managed to normalize abusive treatment over time. That's actually much more serious than a single incident of lost temper. Carmen explained that systematic abuse cases were often prosecuted more aggressively because they showed premeditation and ongoing danger to the child. Prosecutors understood that people who could methodically break down a child's sense of safety and normalcy were likely to escalate their behavior if not stopped. "There's something else you should know," Carmen continued. "Maria Santos reached out to Sophie's school and pediatrician as part of the investigation. She discovered some concerning patterns that support your documentation." My stomach tightened. "What kind of patterns?" Sophie's teacher noted that she'd become increasingly anxious about making mistakes over the past year. She'd started asking permission for things that didn't require permission, using the bathroom, getting a drink of water, sitting down when she was tired. The teacher thought it was cute at first, but then she realized Sophie seemed genuinely afraid of making wrong choices. This matched my own observations. Sophie had started asking permission for everything at home too, even things she'd always been free to do independently. I'd mentioned it to David, who'd said his parents were probably just teaching her to be more considerate of others. The pediatrician's notes show that Sophie had lost weight at her last checkup, despite being in a normal growth phase. When the doctor asked about her eating habits, Sophie said she was trying to eat less so she wouldn't be greedy. A 6-year-old worried about being greedy for eating age-appropriate amounts of food. I felt sick thinking about how Patricia and Frank had twisted Sophie's natural appetite into a source of shame and anxiety. "Maria Santos wants to meet with you tomorrow to go over your documentation in detail. She's particularly interested in the timeline and how the behaviors escalated. She's building a comprehensive case that shows deliberate psychological abuse, not just the physical neglect of the closet incident." After I hung up with Carmen, I walked upstairs to check on Sophie. She was playing quietly in her room, arranging her stuffed animals in careful rows. Each animal was positioned precisely, with equal spacing and perfect alignment. "What are you doing, baby girl?" I asked, sitting down beside her on the floor. "Making sure they're all perfect," Sophie said seriously. "If they're not perfect, someone might get upset." My heart broke a little more. Sophie had internalized the message that imperfection led to punishment, that safety could only be achieved through impossible standards of compliance and control. "Sophie, sweetheart, your toys don't have to be perfect. You can play with them however makes you happy." She looked at me with uncertainty, as if this was a foreign concept. "But what if someone doesn't like how I arrange them?" "Then that's their problem, not yours. Your room is your space, and you get to decide how to play with your toys." I watched her process this information, saw her carefully move one stuffed animal slightly out of alignment, then glance at me nervously to see if I would react with disapproval. When I smiled and nodded encouragingly, she moved another animal, then another, until her careful rows had become a more natural, childlike arrangement. It was a small moment, but it represented something enormous. Sophie beginning to reclaim her right to make choices without fear of punishment. It was going to take time, therapy, and careful rebuilding of her sense of safety, but she was already showing signs of resilience. That afternoon, David called from the hospital during his break between surgeries. "My dad's attorney called," he said, his voice strained. "They want to meet with us to discuss a settlement." "What kind of settlement?" He wouldn't give details over the phone, but apparently they're prepared to make a significant financial offer if we agree to drop the charges and keep the matter private. I felt a surge of anger that surprised me with its intensity. Even now, facing criminal charges and professional humiliation, Patricia and Frank thought they could buy their way out of accountability. They want to pay us to keep quiet about abusing Sophie? That's essentially what it sounds like. The attorney made it very clear that they're prepared to be generous and that fighting this in court would be expensive and emotionally traumatic for everyone involved. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to go to hell," David said, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "I told him that some things aren't for sale, and my daughter's safety is at the top of that list." I felt a wave of love and gratitude for my husband. Despite the pressure from his family, despite the emotional cost of opposing his parents, David was choosing Sophie without hesitation. "How are you doing with all of this?" I asked. Honestly, I feel like I'm grieving. I'm mourning the parents I thought I had, the grandparents I wanted Sophie to have. It's like they died and were replaced by strangers who look exactly like them. That evening, Detective Park called with an update on the criminal investigation. "We've completed our interviews with Patricia and Frank Rodriguez," she said. "I have to say, Natalie, their responses were concerning in ways that go beyond the original charges." "What do you mean?" "Neither of them showed any genuine remorse for what they did to Sophie. They were focused entirely on how the accusations were affecting their reputations and social standing." When I asked Frank how he thought Sophie felt during those 13 hours in the closet, he said she was probably just sleeping most of the time and that children are more resilient than adults give them credit for. This didn't surprise me. Patricia and Frank had always been more concerned with appearances than with substance, more focused on how they were perceived than on how their actions affected others. Patricia was even more troubling. Detective Park continued. She kept insisting that Sophie needed that experience to develop character, that modern children are too soft and entitled. She actually said that Sophie should be grateful for the lesson because it would make her stronger in the long run. I felt my hands clench into fists. The idea that Sophie should be grateful for being terrorized was so twisted, so fundamentally wrong, that it took my breath away. The prosecutor is using their statements as evidence of their mindset and likelihood of reoffending. People who genuinely believe they did nothing wrong are much more likely to repeat their behavior. What's the next step? Arraignments are scheduled for next week. Their attorney will probably try to negotiate a plea deal, but given their statements and the evidence, the prosecutor isn't inclined to be lenient. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of our living room, processing everything that had happened in the past week. 7 days ago, I'd been a daughter-in-law trying to maintain peace with difficult in-laws. Now I was a mother fighting to protect her child from people who'd revealed themselves to be genuinely dangerous. The transformation hadn't been sudden. Looking back, I could see that I'd been preparing for this moment for years, documenting evidence, building professional relationships, developing the skills and knowledge I'd need to fight effectively when the time came. What I hadn't expected was how clear everything would become once I stopped trying to preserve relationships with people who were harming my child. The moral complexity I'd imagined, the difficult balance between family loyalty and child protection, had evaporated the moment I found Sophie in that closet. There was no complexity here. There was a child who'd been hurt by adults who should have protected her. There were people who thought they could use their wealth and social position to avoid consequences for their actions. There was a system designed to protect children, and professionals trained to use that system effectively. I'd spent years doubting myself, questioning my perceptions, trying to find ways to accommodate Patricia and Frank's increasingly controlling behavior. But I wasn't going to doubt myself anymore. I was going to trust my training, my instincts, and my love for Sophie to guide me through whatever came next. The phone rang again, and I saw an unfamiliar number on the display. I answered cautiously. "Is this Natalie Rodriguez?" The voice was female, professional, slightly nervous. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Dr. Jennifer Walsh, and I'm a clinical psychologist who specializes in family trauma. I've been following your case through professional channels, and I wanted to offer my services if you think they might be helpful." I was surprised. Word was apparently spreading through Portland's professional community about our situation. "I appreciate the offer, Dr. Walsh, but Sophie is already working with a trauma specialist. Actually, I was thinking more about offering support for you and your husband. Secondary trauma, the psychological impact on family members who've discovered abuse, is often overlooked, but it can be very significant." She explained that parents who discovered their children had been abused often experienced their own trauma responses, including guilt, hypervigilance, difficulty trusting their own judgment, and relationship stress. These responses were normal but could be addressed with appropriate support. "There's also the issue of your professional role," Dr. Walsh continued. "You're a mandated reporter who discovered abuse in your own family. That creates a unique set of psychological stressors that most people don't understand. I hadn't considered this aspect of the situation." I'd been so focused on protecting Sophie and supporting David that I hadn't thought about my own emotional needs. Would you be willing to meet with David and me together? I think it might be helpful to process some of this with someone who understands the professional complexities. Of course. I have availability tomorrow evening if that works for you. After we hung up, I realized that I was finally doing something I'd avoided for years, accepting help and support instead of trying to handle everything alone. Patricia and Frank had conditioned me to doubt my judgment and isolate myself from professional resources. Breaking free from their influence meant reclaiming my right to seek assistance when I needed it. The next morning, Maria Santos arrived at our house promptly at 9 o'clock. She was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of calm presence that came from decades of handling family crises. I'd worked with her on several cases over the years and had always respected her thoroughness and integrity. "Before we get started," she said, settling into our living room with a thick folder of documents, "I want you to know that this is one of the clearest cases of systematic child abuse I've seen in my career. Your documentation is exemplary, and the evidence is overwhelming." She spread the timeline across our coffee table, using my notes to create a visual representation of Patricia and Frank's escalating behavior. Each incident was marked with a different color: emotional manipulation in blue, control tactics in red, physical neglect in black. "What you've documented here is a textbook case of psychological grooming," Maria explained. "They systematically broke down Sophie's sense of agency and self-worth, while simultaneously undermining your confidence as her mother. This wasn't random cruelty. It was calculated abuse designed to establish dominance and control." She pointed to specific patterns in the timeline. "See how they escalated gradually? Each boundary violation was followed by a period of normal behavior, which prevented you from recognizing the overall pattern. Then they'd push a little further, normalize the new level of control, and escalate again." "Why, Sophie?" I asked. "Why target a child?" "Because children are vulnerable and can't fight back effectively. But also because controlling a child gives them power over the entire family system. By making Sophie afraid and compliant, they forced you and David to choose between confronting them and maintaining peace." Maria explained that this type of abuse was often overlooked because it didn't leave physical evidence. Society was trained to recognize bruises and broken bones, but psychological manipulation was harder to identify and prove. "The closet incident was actually a gift in terms of building a case," she said. "It provided clear physical evidence of what they were capable of. Without that, they might have continued escalating indefinitely, while everyone around them made excuses for their behavior." She pulled out another document, a psychological profile based on Patricia and Frank's statements during their interviews. Both subjects show signs of narcissistic personality traits with a focus on control and dominance. They view Sophie not as an individual with rights and needs, but as an object to be shaped according to their preferences. They genuinely believe they were helping her, which makes them extremely dangerous. Dangerous how? People who believe their abuse is justified are much more likely to escalate and reoffend. They don't see their behavior as wrong, so they have no internal motivation to change. The only thing that will stop them is external consequences severe enough to outweigh their sense of entitlement. Maria reviewed the evidence with forensic precision, explaining how each piece would be presented in court if the case went to trial. The medical documentation, Sophie's consistent statements, the social media posts, my professional observations, everything built a compelling narrative of deliberate child abuse. "The defense will try to frame this as a misunderstanding, a generational difference in parenting styles that got blown out of proportion," she said. "They'll argue that Patricia and Frank are respectable community members who made an error in judgment, not child abusers who deserve criminal sanctions. How do we counter that?" With the timeline, one incident might be an error in judgment. 24 documented incidents over 18 months is a pattern of abuse. The escalation, the manipulation, the lack of remorse, it all points to systematic, rather than accidental harm. Maria also explained the psychological evaluation process that Sophie would need to undergo. A court-appointed specialist would assess her emotional state, her understanding of what had happened, and her capacity to testify if necessary. Sophie is remarkably resilient, Maria said after reviewing Dr. Harrison's reports and the therapy notes. She's processing the trauma appropriately for her age, and she has strong family support. With continued therapy, she should recover well from this experience. What about long-term effects? There may be some ongoing anxiety around authority figures and situations that remind her of the abuse. She might have trust issues or hypervigilance around rule following. But children who have strong supportive responses from their protective parents often emerge from abuse experiences with increased resilience and self-advocacy skills. After Maria left, I felt a strange combination of validation and exhaustion. Having my concerns taken seriously by professionals was enormously relieving, but the clinical discussion of Sophie's trauma was emotionally draining. David came home early from the hospital, having rearranged his schedule to attend our appointment with Dr. Walsh. We found Sophie in the backyard, playing on her swing set with the kind of carefree abandon I hadn't seen from her in months. "She seems different," David observed, watching her through the kitchen window. "Lighter," I agreed. "Like a weight has been lifted." "Do you think she understands what's happening?" "She understands that the people who hurt her are facing consequences, and that we believe her and are protecting her. That's probably enough for now." Dr. Walsh's office was decorated in soothing colors with comfortable furniture and soft lighting. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with a warm smile and intelligent eyes. "I want to start by acknowledging how difficult this situation must be for both of you," she said after we'd settled into her couch. "Discovering that family members have abused your child creates a unique type of trauma that affects every aspect of your life." She explained that secondary trauma could manifest in many ways: hyperprotectiveness, difficulty sleeping, intrusive thoughts about what might have happened to Sophie during other unsupervised visits, guilt about not recognizing the abuse sooner. "David, you're dealing with the additional burden of losing your relationship with your parents. That's a form of ambiguous loss. They're still alive, but the relationship you thought you had with them is gone forever." David nodded, his jaw tight. "I keep thinking about all the times I defended them, all the times I told Natalie she was overreacting. I feel like I failed Sophie by not seeing what they were really like." "That's a normal response, but it's important to understand that their manipulation was sophisticated and targeted. They spent decades conditioning you to trust them and doubt alternative perspectives. Breaking free from that conditioning isn't easy or automatic." Dr. Walsh turned to me. "Natalie, you're processing this through the lens of your professional training, which is both helpful and potentially problematic. You have the knowledge and skills to handle the situation effectively, but you may also be putting pressure on yourself to be perfect, to handle everything flawlessly because you're a professional." She was right. I had been holding myself to impossible standards, expecting myself to navigate this situation without emotional difficulty because I dealt with similar cases at work. The difference is that this is your family, your child, your trauma. You're not required to be objective or professional in your personal life. You're allowed to be angry, scared, overwhelmed, vindictive, or any other emotion that comes up. We spent the next hour exploring our individual and collective responses to the situation. David talked about his anger at his parents, his guilt about the years of missed signs, his fear about what other damage might have been done to Sophie that we hadn't discovered yet. I talked about my rage at being manipulated and gaslit, my professional embarrassment at not recognizing abuse in my own family, my worry about Sophie's long-term psychological health. "Both of your responses are completely normal and healthy," Dr. Walsh assured us. "The fact that you're both prioritizing Sophie's well-being over family relationships shows that your protective instincts are functioning properly." She gave us strategies for managing the stress of the ongoing investigation and legal proceedings, techniques for supporting Sophie without becoming overprotective, and tools for rebuilding our sense of trust and safety as a family. "One thing I want to emphasize," she said as our session ended, "is that this experience, as traumatic as it's been, may ultimately strengthen your family. You've learned that you can trust each other in a crisis, that you'll both prioritize Sophie's well-being over external pressures. That's a powerful foundation to build on." Driving home, David reached over and took my hand. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. for documenting everything, for fighting for Sophie, for not backing down when it got difficult. I'm proud of you too. For choosing us over them, for supporting the investigation even though it's destroying your relationship with your parents. They destroyed the relationship when they hurt Sophie. I just finally acknowledged it. That evening, we received a call from Patricia and Frank's attorney. They were proposing a meeting to discuss resolution options that would be, quote, beneficial for all parties involved. They want to negotiate, David said after he hung up. Apparently, they're prepared to offer significant financial compensation and agree to voluntary restraining orders if we'll drop the criminal charges. What did you tell him? I told him that our daughter's safety isn't negotiable. I told him that if they wanted to avoid criminal prosecution, they should have thought about that before they locked a 6-year-old in a closet. The attorney had warned that proceeding with the criminal case would be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally difficult for Sophie. He'd implied that we were being vindictive and unreasonable by refusing to consider alternatives. He actually suggested that we were traumatizing Sophie more by putting her through the legal process than they did by abusing her, David said, his voice tight with anger. Classic abuser tactic, I replied. Blame the victim for the consequences of reporting the abuse. Make us feel guilty for seeking justice. We were done being manipulated. We were done prioritizing their comfort over Sophie's safety. We were done accepting partial solutions that allowed them to avoid full accountability for their actions. The war they'd started by hurting our daughter was going to end with their complete defeat, no matter how much money they threw at the problem or how many lawyers they hired to protect them. Justice for Sophie wasn't negotiable. Her safety wasn't for sale, and we were going to see this through to the end, whatever it cost us personally. The courthouse steps were slick with early morning rain as David and I walked toward the imposing granite building where Patricia and Frank would face their arraignment. Sophie was safely at school, unaware that this day would determine whether her abusers would face real consequences for their actions. I carried a leather briefcase containing copies of every document, every piece of evidence, every professional statement that had brought us to this moment. As we climbed the steps, I spotted them immediately. Patricia stood under the courthouse portico wearing a navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her silver hair styled in a perfect chignon, diamond earrings catching the gray morning light. She looked every inch the respectable society matron, the kind of woman who organized charity galas and served on museum boards. Frank stood beside her in his charcoal gray suit, the same one he'd worn to Sophie's baptism 3 years ago. His posture was rigid, military straight, conveying the authority and respectability he'd cultivated over decades of practicing law in Portland's most prestigious firms. They were flanked by 2 attorneys I recognized from their advertisements in the city's business journals, expensive lawyers who specialized in making wealthy people's problems disappear. The irony wasn't lost on me. These were the same steps where I'd accompanied dozens of families over the years, helping parents navigate the legal system to protect their children from abuse. I'd stood in those same hallways, filling out the same paperwork, making the same arguments about child safety and family preservation. But I'd never imagined I'd be on these steps fighting my own in-laws. Patricia's eyes met mine across the courthouse plaza, and for a moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Not remorse, but surprise. She'd expected us to accept their settlement offer, to prioritize family unity over justice. The idea that her daughter-in-law, the social worker she dismissed and undermined for years, would have the audacity to drag her into criminal court was clearly incomprehensible to her. We entered the courthouse through separate entrances, but I could feel the weight of their presence in the building. The marble floors echoed with footsteps and hushed conversations as lawyers, defendants, and families moved through the corridors seeking their own versions of justice. District Attorney Jennifer Walsh met us in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her late 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and intelligent brown eyes that assessed everything around her with practiced efficiency. "Before we go in there," she said, spreading files across the conference table, "I want you to understand what's going to happen today and what we're up against." She explained that arraignments were typically brief proceedings where charges were formally read and defendants entered their pleas. However, Patricia and Frank's legal team had already signaled their intention to challenge every aspect of the case, starting with pretrial motions designed to exclude evidence and discredit witnesses. Their strategy is fairly predictable, Walsh continued. They're going to argue that you're a vindictive daughter-in-law using your professional position to wage a personal vendetta. They'll claim that Sophie was coached to fabricate her story, that the medical evidence is inconclusive, and that the whole situation is a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by an overzealous social worker with a grudge. I'd expected this approach. Wealthy defendants always tried to put their accusers on trial instead of facing accountability for their own actions. However, Walsh said with a slight smile, they've underestimated the strength of our evidence and the credibility of our witnesses. Dr. Harrison's medical documentation is unassailable. Detective Park's investigation was thorough and professional. Your own documentation spans 18 months and shows a clear pattern of escalating abuse. She pulled out a thick binder containing witness statements from Sophie's teachers, pediatrician, therapist, and several colleagues who'd observed changes in my behavior over the past year. Most importantly, we have Sophie herself. She's been interviewed multiple times by different professionals, and her story has never wavered. She describes events in age-appropriate language with emotional responses that are entirely consistent with trauma. No 6-year-old could maintain a fabricated story through that level of scrutiny. Walsh also revealed something I hadn't known. Patricia and Frank had hired a private investigator to dig into my background, looking for evidence of mental instability, professional misconduct, or personal grudges that could explain my false allegations. They found nothing, she said with satisfaction. 5 years of exemplary service records, commendations from supervisors, testimonials from families you've helped. The investigator actually told their attorney that you appeared to be exactly what you claimed to be, a competent professional who recognized child abuse and responded appropriately. The irony was perfect. They'd spent thousands of dollars trying to prove I was unstable or vindictive, only to confirm that I was credible and competent. As we entered the courtroom, I was struck by how different this felt from the family court proceedings I usually attended. Criminal court had a weight and formality that underscored the seriousness of the charges. Patricia and Frank weren't just facing family embarrassment or civil consequences. They were facing potential jail time, permanent criminal records, and the complete destruction of their carefully cultivated reputations. The judge, the Honorable Margaret Chen, was known for her no-nonsense approach to criminal proceedings and her particular intolerance for crimes against children. She'd been a prosecutor before ascending to the bench, and she brought that perspective to her rulings. The state of Oregon versus Patricia Rodriguez and Frank Rodriguez, the clerk announced, charges of child endangerment, criminal mistreatment, and unlawful imprisonment. Patricia and Frank stood with their attorneys as the charges were formally read. I watched their faces during this process, looking for any sign of remorse or understanding of the gravity of their situation. Instead, I saw resignation mixed with barely controlled anger, not at themselves for hurting Sophie, but at us for refusing to handle this family matter privately. Their lead attorney, Marcus Webb, was everything I'd expected from their choice of representation. Expensive suit, perfectly styled silver hair, the kind of practiced confidence that came from decades of getting wealthy clients out of trouble. He'd built his career on making problems disappear through strategic settlements and favorable plea bargains. Your Honor, Webb began when given the opportunity to address the court. My clients are respected members of this community who have never been involved in any criminal proceedings. Mr. Rodriguez is a partner at one of Portland's most prestigious law firms. Mrs. Rodriguez serves on the boards of multiple charitable organizations. They are loving grandparents who became involved in a family dispute that has unfortunately been criminalized by overzealous authorities. I felt my jaw tighten at his characterization of Sophie's abuse as a family dispute. This was exactly the kind of minimization and victim-blaming I'd expected. Webb continued. The alleged incident arose from a misunderstanding about appropriate disciplinary measures. At worst, this represents an error in judgment by elderly grandparents trying to help with a difficult child. It certainly doesn't warrant criminal prosecution and the destruction of two distinguished reputations. Judge Chen's expression remained neutral, but I caught a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested Webb's strategy wasn't landing as intended. District Attorney Walsh stood to respond. Your Honor, this case involves the systematic abuse of a 6-year-old child by adults who used their positions of trust and authority to inflict both physical and psychological harm. The defendants locked a child in a closet for 13 hours, denying her access to water, while they enjoyed spa treatments at a luxury resort. She gestured toward the evidence table. The medical documentation shows clear signs of dehydration and psychological trauma. The defendants' own social media posts document their activities while the child was imprisoned. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was deliberate cruelty followed by callous indifference to the child's suffering. Walsh's presentation was clinical and devastating. She methodically dismantled Webb's narrative of confused grandparents, replacing it with evidence of calculated abuse by adults who knew exactly what they were doing. Furthermore, Your Honor, the investigation has revealed a pattern of escalating abuse spanning 18 months. The closet incident wasn't an isolated event. It was the culmination of systematic psychological manipulation designed to break down the child's resistance and establish complete control over her behavior. Judge Chen reviewed the preliminary evidence for several minutes before addressing both legal teams. Mr. Webb, your clients, community standing and lack of prior criminal history will be noted for the record. However, the charges before this court are serious and supported by substantial evidence. I'm setting bail at $50,000 each, with conditions that include no contact with the alleged victim and no unsupervised contact with any children under the age of 18. Webb immediately objected. Your Honor, these conditions are unnecessarily restrictive. My clients pose no flight risk and no danger to the community. They're requesting permission to maintain family relationships while this matter is resolved. Mr. Webb, Judge Chen said with a slight edge to her voice, your clients are charged with imprisoning a 6-year-old child in a closet. I consider that behavior to be inherently dangerous to children. The no-contact provisions will remain in place. I felt a surge of satisfaction watching Patricia's face as the judge imposed restrictions that would effectively exile her from Sophie's life. For the first time since this ordeal began, there were consequences she couldn't negotiate or manipulate away. As we left the courthouse, David and I were approached by a woman I didn't recognize. She was middle-aged, professionally dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to asking difficult questions. Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm Sarah Chen with the Portland Tribune. Could I ask you a few questions about today's proceedings? I'd been dreading this moment. Patricia and Frank moved in social circles where reputation was everything, and a public scandal involving child abuse charges would be devastating to their standing in the community. But I also knew that Sophie deserved to have her story told accurately, without the spin and manipulation that her abusers would inevitably attempt. I can give you a brief statement, I said carefully. How do you respond to allegations that this prosecution is motivated by personal animosity rather than genuine concern for child welfare? The question revealed that Patricia and Frank's legal team was already working the media, trying to frame the narrative in their favor. I'm a licensed clinical social worker who has dedicated my career to protecting children from abuse, I said evenly. When I discovered that my daughter had been systematically mistreated by family members, I responded exactly as I would in any case involving child abuse, by documenting the evidence and reporting it to appropriate authorities. What do you say to people who argue that this is a family matter that should have been handled privately? Child abuse is never a private family matter. It's a crime that requires legal intervention to protect the victim and prevent future harm. My daughter deserves the same protection from abuse that any child would receive, regardless of her relationship to the perpetrators. The reporter scribbled notes, then asked the question I'd been expecting. Are you concerned about the impact of these proceedings on your daughter's relationship with her grandparents? My primary concern is my daughter's safety and well-being. Adults who abuse children have already damaged those relationships through their own choices. My role as her mother is to protect her from further harm, not to preserve relationships with people who have hurt her. After the reporter left, David and I drove to Sophie's school to pick her up for a therapy appointment. She bounded out of her classroom with the kind of energy I hadn't seen from her in months, chattering about her art project and the book her teacher had read during story time. How did court go? She asked as we buckled her into her car seat. The judge said that Grandma Patty and Grandpa Frank have to stay away from you until everything is finished, I explained. They can't come to our house or try to talk to you. Sophie nodded solemnly. Good. I don't want to see them anymore. Her matter-of-fact response was both heartbreaking and reassuring. Children often recovered from trauma more quickly than adults because they didn't carry the emotional baggage of complicated family relationships. Sophie understood that people who hurt her should face consequences, and she felt safer knowing that those consequences were being enforced. Dr. Patricia Williams, Sophie's trauma therapist, met us in her cheerful office, decorated with children's artwork and comfortable reading nooks. Sophie had been seeing Dr. Williams twice a week since the closet incident, working through her fears and rebuilding her sense of safety. How has Sophie been since the last session? Dr. Williams asked as Sophie settled into the play area with a dollhouse. Much better, I said honestly. She's sleeping through the night more consistently, and she seems more relaxed during the day. She started asking for things she wants instead of waiting to be offered them. This was significant progress. One of the most damaging aspects of Patricia and Frank's abuse had been their insistence that Sophie's basic needs were privileges to be earned rather than rights to be respected. Learning to advocate for herself again was a crucial part of her recovery. Dr. Williams spent the session helping Sophie process the court proceedings in age-appropriate terms. Using dolls and drawings, Sophie expressed her understanding that, quote, the people who hurt me have to go see a judge, and the judge will make sure they can't hurt me anymore. Are you scared about what might happen? Dr. Williams asked. Sophie considered this carefully. I'm not scared anymore because Mama and Daddy are protecting me. I'm just sad that they were mean to me when they were supposed to be nice. Her response demonstrated remarkable emotional intelligence for a 6-year-old. She understood that she hadn't deserved the treatment she'd received, and she was processing the loss of the grandparent relationship she'd hoped to have. After the therapy session, we returned home to find several cars parked on our street. As we pulled into our driveway, I realized they belonged to reporters who'd apparently tracked down our address. Mrs. Rodriguez. One called out as we got out of the car. Do you have any comment on the allegations that you're using your professional position to pursue a personal vendetta? I ushered Sophie quickly into the house while David dealt with the reporters. This was exactly what I'd feared, the circus that surrounded high-profile criminal cases involving wealthy defendants. Inside, I found several voicemail messages from journalists, lawyers, and community members who'd heard about the case. Patricia and Frank's social circle was closing ranks, with several people calling to express their disbelief that such wonderful grandparents could be accused of child abuse. But there were other messages too, from colleagues, friends, and even strangers who wanted to express support for our decision to seek prosecution. One message was from a woman whose own children had been abused by their grandfather, thanking me for, quote, having the courage to speak up when so many families stay silent. That evening, David's phone rang. The caller ID showed his brother Michael's number, David's younger brother who lived in Seattle and had maintained a careful distance from family drama over the years. I heard about the charges, Michael said without preamble. Is it true? Did Mom and Dad really lock Sophie in a closet? David explained the situation, while I listened to his side of the conversation. I could hear the shock and disbelief in Michael's responses, the same denial that David had initially experienced. But why would they do something like that? Michael asked. They've always been strict, but this seems completely out of character. That's what I thought too, David said. But Natalie has documentation going back 18 months showing a pattern of escalating abuse. The closet incident wasn't random, it was the culmination of systematic psychological manipulation. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Michael struggling to reconcile his image of their parents with the evidence of their behavior. Eventually, he asked the question that was really driving his call. What do you need from me? How can I support you and Sophie through this? It was the first time since the charges were filed that any member of David's extended family had offered support instead of criticism. Most of their relatives had either remained silent or actively defended Patricia and Frank, suggesting that we were overreacting to normal generational differences in child rearing. Just believe us, David said simply. Don't try to minimize what happened or suggest that we should have handled it differently. Sophie was hurt by our parents, and we're doing what we need to do to protect her. After David hung up, we received another call, this one from Marcus Webb, Patricia and Frank's attorney. Mr. Rodriguez, I hope you'll reconsider our previous offer to resolve this matter privately. My clients are prepared to be very generous in their compensation package, and we can structure the agreement to ensure that something like this never happens again. David's response was immediate and unequivocal. Mr. Webb, I already told your office that our daughter's safety isn't for sale. If your clients wanted to avoid criminal prosecution, they should have thought about that before they abused her. I understand your anger, Webb said, his voice taking on a more persuasive tone. But you need to consider the long-term impact of this prosecution on your family. Criminal trials are public, invasive, and traumatic for everyone involved. Is putting a 6-year-old through that really in her best interests? It was a classic manipulation tactic, framing the pursuit of justice as harmful to the victim. I'd seen this approach countless times in my professional work, and I'd learned to recognize it immediately. Mr. Webb, I said, taking the phone from David, I'm a licensed clinical social worker with extensive experience in child trauma cases. Sophie is receiving excellent therapeutic support to help her navigate this process. What would be truly harmful to her is learning that adults who hurt children face no consequences for their actions. Mrs. Rodriguez, surely you understand that this prosecution is as much about your professional reputation as it is about your daughter's welfare. You've turned a family disagreement into a public spectacle to prove a point about your expertise. I felt my temper flare at his suggestion that I was using Sophie's abuse to advance my career. Mr. Webb, the only point I'm proving is that child abusers face consequences regardless of their wealth or social standing. Your clients are going to trial, and they're going to be held accountable for what they did to my daughter. After I hung up, David looked at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. Are you okay? He was trying to get under your skin. I'm fine. I've dealt with attorneys like him before. They think they can intimidate or manipulate their way out of any situation. He's about to learn that some things aren't negotiable. The next few weeks brought a steady escalation in the media attention surrounding the case. Patricia and Frank's social circle had clearly decided to wage a public relations campaign, with several prominent community members giving interviews about their shock and disbelief at the charges. Frank's law partner held a press conference declaring his absolute confidence in Frank's innocence and characterizing the prosecution as a tragic misunderstanding that has gotten completely out of hand. He described Frank as a pillar of the legal community whose reputation was being destroyed by unfounded allegations. Patricia's friends from the Symphony Association organized a letter-writing campaign to the district attorney's office, urging them to drop the charges against one of Portland's most generous philanthropists. The letters painted Patricia. A reporter from Oregon Public Broadcasting discovered that Frank's law firm had quietly settled several workplace harassment complaints over the years, including one involving inappropriate behavior toward a female associate who'd been significantly younger than him. Another investigation revealed that Patricia had been asked to step down from her volunteer position at a children's hospital the previous year, following complaints about her treatment of young patients. According to confidential sources, she'd been criticized for speaking harshly to children who were crying or uncooperative during medical procedures. These revelations painted a very different picture than the one their supporters were promoting. Instead of beloved community leaders who'd made an isolated error in judgment, they appeared to be people with a pattern of inappropriate behavior toward vulnerable individuals. The most damaging revelation came when a former housekeeper came forward with her own story about Patricia and Frank's treatment of children. Maria Gonzalez had worked for them for 3 years during David's adolescence, and she described a household atmosphere of rigid control and harsh punishment. Mrs. Rodriguez would make the children stand at attention for inspection every morning, Maria told investigators. If their clothes weren't perfect or their hair wasn't exactly right, she would make them start over until they met her standards. Mr. Rodriguez would time how long it took them to complete tasks and assign punishments if they weren't fast enough. Maria also described witnessing Patricia force David to stand in a corner for hours because he'd tracked mud through the house, and Frank making David's younger brother Michael run laps around their yard in the rain because he'd forgotten to put away his bicycle. I wanted to say something at the time, Maria explained. But I needed the job, and they made it clear that they didn't welcome interference in their parenting methods. I always wondered how those boys turned out, whether they were okay. When David heard about Maria's statement, he was quiet for a long time. I'd forgotten about some of that, he said finally. Or maybe I'd convinced myself it was normal because that's all I knew. But standing in that corner for hours, I remember how my legs would cramp and how scared I was to move even slightly. Why didn't you ever tell me about this? Because I thought it was normal. They convinced me that other families just weren't as disciplined as ours, that we were learning important lessons about responsibility and consequences. It wasn't until I saw Sophie in that closet that I realized what those lessons actually were. The revelations about Patricia and Frank's history significantly strengthened our case while undermining their public support. Several of their character witnesses quietly withdrew their willingness to testify, and the letter-writing campaign from Patricia's social circle dwindled to a trickle. More importantly, other victims began coming forward. A family friend revealed that Patricia had once locked their 8-year-old son in a bathroom during a dinner party because he'd been too loud during adult conversation. A former neighbor described finding their 10-year-old daughter crying in their backyard after Patricia had screamed at her for walking across their lawn. Each new revelation painted a clearer picture of adults who viewed children as objects to be controlled rather than individuals to be nurtured. The prosecution was no longer just about Sophie's experience. It was about a pattern of behavior that had affected multiple children over many years. As the trial date approached, Webb made one final attempt to negotiate a settlement. This time, he called District Attorney Walsh directly, bypassing David and me entirely. He offered to have his clients plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for suspended sentences and community service. Walsh told us during a pre-trial meeting, "No jail time but permanent criminal records and mandatory counseling." What did you tell him? I told him that we weren't interested in deals that allowed child abusers to avoid meaningful consequences. His clients are going to trial, and if convicted, they're going to face appropriate sentences. Walsh explained that the prosecution was seeking 1 year in jail for each defendant, followed by 3 years of supervised probation with no contact with Sophie. They would also be required to register as child abusers, which would prevent them from working or volunteering with children in the future. The sentences might seem light for such serious charges, she said, but given their ages and lack of prior criminal history, it's within the typical range for first-time offenders. The important thing is the permanent criminal record and the protection it provides for Sophie and other children. The night before the trial began, Sophie asked me a question that broke my heart. "Mama, did I do something wrong that made Grandma Patty and Grandpa Frank hurt me?" I knelt down beside her bed and took her small hands in mine. "Sophie, sweetheart, you did absolutely nothing wrong. Adults who hurt children always try to make the children think it's their fault, but it never is. You were a perfect little girl who deserved love and kindness, and what they did to you was completely wrong." Then why did they do it? How do you explain to a 6-year-old that some adults are broken in ways that make them cruel to people who can't protect themselves? How do you preserve her innocence while helping her understand that the world contains people who choose to cause harm? Some grown-ups have problems in their hearts that make them mean to children, I said carefully. It's not because the children did anything bad, it's because the grown-ups never learned how to be kind and loving the way they should be. Sophie nodded seriously, processing this information with the gravity of a much older child. "Will the judge make sure they can't hurt other kids like me?" "Yes, baby girl." That's exactly what the judge is going to do. As I tucked her into bed that night, I thought about how much she'd grown through this ordeal. She was developing a sophisticated understanding of justice, accountability, and protection that would serve her well throughout her life. What Patricia and Frank had intended as a lesson in submission and compliance had instead taught her that she deserved safety, that her voice mattered, and that adults who hurt children would face consequences. Tomorrow, the trial would begin, and Sophie's story would be told in its entirety. A jury of 12 strangers would decide whether her abusers faced meaningful consequences or walked away with minimal punishment. But regardless of the verdict, Sophie already understood the most important lesson of all, that she was worth fighting for, that her suffering mattered, and that the adults who truly loved her would move heaven and earth to protect her from harm. The war Patricia and Frank had started by hurting our daughter was about to reach its climax in a Portland courtroom, where the truth would finally triumph over wealth, manipulation, and the arrogant belief that some people were above accountability for their actions. The morning of the trial arrived with an unexpected burst of sunshine that seemed to promise clarity after months of gray uncertainty. Sophie had insisted on helping me choose my outfit. Selecting a navy blazer, she said, made me look strong like Wonder Woman. David wore his best suit, the one he'd worn to our wedding 8 years ago, as if this day required the same level of solemnity and commitment. We arrived at the courthouse early, before the media circus could fully assemble, and found Detective Park waiting for us in the witness preparation room. She looked tired but determined, carrying a thick binder that contained months of investigative work. "I wanted to give you both a heads up about what to expect today," she said, settling into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs. "Webb is going to try to make this about you, Natalie. He's going to suggest that you're a vindictive professional who manipulated the system to get revenge on your in-laws." I'd been preparing for this attack for weeks, working with District Attorney Walsh to anticipate every angle Webb might use to discredit my testimony. He's also going to paint Patricia and Frank as confused elderly grandparents who made an honest mistake in disciplinary methods. He'll emphasize their community service, their charitable giving, their lack of prior criminal history. "What about Sophie?" David asked. "Is she going to have to testify?" Judge Chen has agreed to allow her recorded interview to be played for the jury instead of requiring live testimony. It's less traumatic for her, and the recording actually captures her emotional responses more effectively than courtroom testimony might. This was a relief. I'd been dreading the possibility of Sophie having to face Patricia and Frank in a formal courtroom setting, answering questions from attorneys who might try to confuse or intimidate her. As we entered the courtroom, I was struck by how many people had come to observe the proceedings. The gallery was filled with familiar faces: colleagues from the Children's Advocacy Center, parents from cases I'd worked over the years, members of David's medical team who'd heard about the situation and wanted to show support. But there were also unfamiliar faces, people who'd clearly come to support Patricia and Frank. Well-dressed older adults with the bearing of Portland's social elite, probably friends from their various charitable boards and professional associations. They sat on the opposite side of the gallery, creating a visual representation of the battle lines that had been drawn. Patricia and Frank entered through a side door, flanked by their legal team. Patricia wore a conservative black dress with a string of pearls, her silver hair perfectly styled, her makeup applied with professional precision. She looked like someone attending a board meeting rather than facing criminal charges for child abuse. Frank wore his charcoal suit with a navy tie, his posture military straight, his expression revealing nothing. They moved with the same authoritative confidence they'd always displayed, as if they expected their mere presence to convince the jury of their respectability. Judge Chen called the court to order, and the real battle began. District Attorney Walsh's opening statement was methodical and devastating. She walked the jury through Sophie's normal day on that terrible Tuesday, contrasting Patricia and Frank's spa luxury with their granddaughter's imprisonment. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about adults who used their power and authority to inflict suffering on a helpless child. The defendants didn't lose their tempers or make a momentary error in judgment. They systematically planned and executed a punishment designed to break a 6-year-old's spirit because she had the audacity to ask for water." Walsh used a timeline projected on a large screen to show exactly what happened hour by hour. At 8 in the morning, Sophie asked for a snack. At 9:30, she was locked in the closet. At 10:15, Patricia and Frank left for their spa appointment. At 11 o'clock, they were receiving couples massages while Sophie was trapped in darkness. At 1:30, while the defendants were enjoying champagne and hors d'oeuvre, Sophie was so thirsty that she tried to lick moisture from the inside walls of the closet. At 3 o'clock, while they were getting pedicures, she had given up calling for help because no one was coming. The timeline continued through the entire afternoon and evening, each timestamp highlighting the deliberate nature of Sophie's abandonment. The jury members looked increasingly uncomfortable as the hours stretched on, the contrast between the defendant's luxury and the child's suffering becoming undeniably stark. Walsh concluded her opening with a simple but powerful statement. The defendants want you to believe this was a misunderstanding about discipline. But there is no misunderstanding about denying water to a 6-year-old child. There is no misunderstanding about leaving her locked and alone while you enjoy spa treatments. This was cruelty, pure and simple, and it demands accountability. Marcus Webb's opening statement attempted to reframe the entire narrative. He painted Patricia and Frank as devoted grandparents who'd been trying to help with a difficult child, only to have their good intentions twisted by a vindictive daughter-in-law with professional axes to grind. "My clients are not child abusers," he declared with practiced sincerity. "They are loving grandparents who found themselves caring for a challenging child and made decisions that have been misinterpreted by authorities looking for evidence of wrongdoing." Webb spent considerable time highlighting Patricia and Frank's community involvement, their charitable giving, their decades of professional service. He showed photographs of them at various fundraising events, accepting awards for their volunteer work, surrounded by smiling children at charity functions. "These are not the faces of child abusers," he told the jury. "These are respected members of our community who have devoted their lives to helping others. The idea that they would deliberately harm their own granddaughter is not just wrong, it's absurd." He then launched into his attack on my credibility and motivations. Natalie Rodriguez is a social worker who specializes in finding abuse where others see normal family dynamics. She has made a career out of separating children from their families, and when she turned her professional suspicions on her own in-laws, she saw exactly what she's trained to see: evidence of abuse that simply doesn't exist. Webb suggested that I'd coached Sophie to fabricate her story, that I'd manipulated the medical evidence, and that I'd used my professional connections to build a case against innocent grandparents who'd simply tried to provide structure and discipline. "This prosecution isn't about protecting a child," he concluded. "It's about a professional vendetta, wrapped in the language of child welfare. Don't let the state destroy two good people because one vindictive woman refuses to admit she was wrong." The first witness called by the prosecution was Dr. Michael Harrison, whose medical testimony established the physical evidence of Sophie's dehydration and confinement. Webb tried to challenge his findings, suggesting that the symptoms could have been caused by a routine childhood illness rather than deliberate deprivation. But Dr. Harrison was unshakable. He'd examined thousands of children over his career, and he could distinguish between medical conditions and abuse-related injuries with absolute certainty. The child showed classic signs of intentional dehydration, quote, he testified. Her blood chemistry, her physical symptoms, her behavioral responses, everything was consistent with someone who had been deliberately denied access to water for an extended period. Webb's cross-examination attempted to cast doubt on the timeline, suggesting that Sophie might have been dehydrated before the closet incident occurred. But Dr. Harrison's thorough documentation made this argument impossible to sustain. "The child's mother brought her directly to my office from the closet," he said. "There was no opportunity for alternative explanations. She had been healthy that morning, and she was severely dehydrated that evening. The only thing that happened in between was being locked in confinement by the defendants." Detective Park's testimony walked the jury through her investigation, including the interviews with Patricia and Frank that had revealed their complete lack of remorse. She played audio recordings of their statements, allowing the jury to hear their actual words rather than Webb's sanitized interpretation. When I asked Mrs. Rodriguez how she thought her granddaughter felt during those 13 hours, she told me that children need to learn that actions have consequences. Detective Park testified. When I asked if she was concerned about the child's well-being, she said that modern children are too soft and that this experience would make Sophie stronger. The recordings were damning. Patricia's voice, captured with perfect clarity, showed no maternal concern or regret. Instead, she sounded annoyed that anyone would question her methods, defensive about her right to discipline Sophie however she saw fit. Frank's recorded statement was even worse. When asked if he would handle the situation differently if given another chance, he'd said, I might leave her in there longer next time. Children need to understand that defiance isn't tolerated in well-ordered families. Webb objected repeatedly during Detective Park's testimony, claiming that his client's statements were being taken out of context. But there was no context that could make their callousness acceptable to a jury of parents and community members. Maria Santos, the CPS investigator, testified about the broader pattern of abuse she'd uncovered during her investigation. She presented my documentation spanning 18 months, showing how Patricia and Frank's behavior had escalated gradually until it reached the level of criminal abuse. This wasn't an isolated incident, Santos explained. The closet imprisonment was the culmination of systematic psychological manipulation designed to break down the child's resistance and establish complete control over her behavior. Santos described how abusers typically tested boundaries gradually, normalizing increasingly severe treatment until families began to accept behaviors that would have been shocking if they'd occurred suddenly. The defendants conditioned everyone around them to view their cruelty as expertise, she testified. They convinced the family that their harsh methods were necessary for the child's development, making it easier for them to escalate without facing immediate resistance. Webb's cross-examination attempted to portray Santos as biased, suggesting that CPS investigators were predisposed to find abuse even when none existed. But Santos had 30 years of experience and an exemplary record of protecting children while preserving families whenever possible. I don't remove children from homes lightly, she said in response to Webb's questioning. I understand the importance of family relationships, and I work hard to help families stay together safely. But when adults deliberately hurt children, my job is to ensure that those children are protected, regardless of the adult's social standing or community reputation. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Sophie's recorded interview was played for the jury. The video showed her sitting in the child-friendly interview room at the Children's Advocacy Center, speaking in her clear, 6-year-old voice about what had happened to her. Grandma Patty said I was being naughty because I asked for water. Sophie's voice filled the courtroom. She said naughty girls don't get to drink water until they learn to be grateful. You could have heard a pin drop as Sophie described the hours in the closet, her unsuccessful attempts to open the door, her growing thirst and fear as the day wore on. I tried to be very quiet so she wouldn't be more mad at me, Sophie said. But it was dark and I was scared, and I really wanted my mama. Several jury members wiped away tears as Sophie described calling for help that never came, explaining how she'd eventually given up because she realized no one was listening. When Webb cross-examined the recording, trying to suggest that Sophie had been coached or that her statements were unreliable, Judge Chen shut him down firmly. Mr. Webb, this child was interviewed by trained professionals using established protocols designed to prevent coaching or suggestion. Her statements are clear, consistent, and credible. Move on to your next line of questioning. The testimony from Maria Gonzalez, the former housekeeper, provided crucial context about Patricia and Frank's long history of inappropriate behavior toward children. She described the rigid atmosphere of control and punishment that had characterized their household during David's childhood. They treated children like soldiers who needed to be broken down and rebuilt, she testified. There was no warmth, no patience, no understanding that children make mistakes because they're learning. Everything was about control and submission. Webb tried to discredit Maria's testimony by emphasizing that she'd been fired from her position and might harbor resentment toward her former employers. But Maria's composure and detailed recollections made her testimony compelling and believable. I didn't come forward because I want revenge, she said. I came forward because I couldn't live with myself, knowing that they were still hurting children, and I said nothing. When it came time for my own testimony, I felt calmer than I'd expected. Months of preparation had taught me to present facts without emotion, to let the evidence speak for itself rather than trying to convince anyone of my perspective. Walsh walked me through my professional qualifications, my years of experience working with abused children, my reputation within the child welfare community. She established my credibility before moving into the specific events surrounding Sophie's abuse. Mrs. Rodriguez, can you describe your relationship with the defendants prior to this incident? I tried very hard to maintain positive relationships with my husband's parents, I said. I respected their role in Sophie's life and wanted her to have loving grandparents. I made excuses for behaviors that concerned me because I didn't want to create family conflict. When did you first become concerned about their treatment of Sophie? I described the pattern I'd documented over 18 months, explaining how each individual incident had seemed manageable, but the overall trajectory had been increasingly troubling. As a professional, I knew the behaviors I was observing were concerning, but as a daughter-in-law, I kept hoping that communication and patience would resolve the issues without requiring formal intervention. Walsh asked me to walk through the day I'd found Sophie in the closet, and I provided a clinical account of her physical condition, her emotional state, and my immediate response. When I found my daughter dehydrated and terrified after being locked in confinement for 13 hours, my training took over. I documented her condition, sought medical attention, and reported the abuse to appropriate authorities. I did exactly what I would do in any case involving a child who'd been deliberately harmed. Webb's cross-examination was aggressive and personal, just as I'd expected. He accused me of using my professional position to wage a personal vendetta, of coaching Sophie to fabricate her story, of manipulating evidence to support predetermined conclusions. Mrs. Rodriguez, isn't it true that you've harbored resentment toward my client since the beginning of your marriage? No, that's not true. I worked very hard to build positive relationships with them. But they criticized your parenting methods, didn't they? They suggested that Sophie needed more structure and discipline. They made suggestions that I disagreed with, yes, but I never let personal disagreements affect my professional judgment. Webb pressed harder, suggesting that I deliberately misinterpreted normal disciplinary actions as abuse because I couldn't accept criticism of my parenting. Mrs. Rodriguez, my clients are respected members of this community with no history of violence or abuse. Isn't it more likely that you're wrong about their intentions than that they're secret child abusers? I looked directly at the jury as I answered. Mr. Webb, I've been wrong about many things in my personal life, but I've never been wrong about recognizing child abuse. That's my profession, my expertise, and my responsibility. When adults hurt children, I respond appropriately, regardless of their community standing or family relationships. Webb's attacks continued for over an hour, but they felt increasingly desperate, as it became clear that my testimony was resonating with the jury. He couldn't shake my professional credentials or my consistent account of events. The defense's case was brief and largely ineffective. Patricia and Frank chose not to testify, probably on advice of counsel since their recorded statements had already damaged their credibility. Instead, Webb presented character witnesses who praised their community service and charitable giving. But these testimonials felt hollow in the face of Sophie's recorded testimony and the medical evidence of her suffering. You could see the jury struggling to reconcile the respectable community figures being described with the adults who'd locked a 6-year-old in a closet. During closing arguments, Walsh reminded the jury that this case wasn't about Patricia and Frank's reputation or community standing. It was about what they'd done to Sophie. The defendants want you to focus on their charitable work, their professional accomplishments, their social connections. But none of that changes the fact that they locked a 6-year-old child in a closet for 13 hours and denied her access to water while they enjoyed spa treatments. She pointed to the evidence table, stacked high with medical records, interview transcripts, and photographic documentation. This isn't a case built on speculation or vindictive accusations. This is a case built on medical evidence, recorded statements, and the clear testimony of a child who was brave enough to tell the truth about what happened to her. Walsh concluded with a powerful appeal for accountability. The defendants chose to hurt Sophie Rodriguez because they thought they could get away with it. They thought their wealth and social standing would protect them from consequences. They thought a 6-year-old child's suffering was less important than their desire for control. Prove them wrong. Webb's closing argument was a desperate attempt to shift blame and minimize the severity of what had occurred. He characterized the incident as a tragic misunderstanding that had been blown out of proportion by overzealous authorities. But his arguments felt increasingly weak against the weight of evidence. How do you call 13 hours of confinement without water a misunderstanding? How do you explain away spa photos posted while a child suffered? The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, their faces were grim, and I knew immediately that justice had been served. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Chen asked. We have, Your Honor, the foreman replied. On the charge of child endangerment against Patricia Rodriguez, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of criminal mistreatment against Patricia Rodriguez, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of unlawful imprisonment against Patricia Rodriguez, how do you find? Guilty. The same verdicts were read for Frank. Guilty on all counts. I felt David's hand squeeze mine as the verdicts were announced. Behind us, I could hear quiet crying from Patricia and Frank's supporters, while our side of the gallery sat in satisfied silence. Patricia's face was pale and shocked, as if she couldn't believe that 12 ordinary citizens had actually held her accountable for her actions. Frank stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, probably already planning appeals and post-conviction strategies. Judge Chen scheduled sentencing for the following month, allowing time for pre-sentence investigations and victim impact statements. As we left the courthouse, reporters shouted questions and cameras flashed, but I felt oddly peaceful. The truth had been told, believed, and validated by a jury of our peers. That evening, we sat down with Sophie to explain what had happened in age-appropriate terms. The judge and the jury decided that what Grandma Patty and Grandpa Frank did to you was wrong, David explained. They're going to have consequences for hurting you, and they can't be around you anymore. Sophie nodded seriously. Good. That means other kids will be safe too. Her response reminded me why we'd fought this battle. It wasn't just about our family. It was about preventing Patricia and Frank from hurting other children in the future. 1 month later, we returned to the courthouse for sentencing. Judge Chen had reviewed the pre-sentence reports, victim impact statements, and character references for both sides. This court has considered all the evidence presented during trial and the additional information provided for sentencing. She began. The defendants' lack of remorse and their continued insistence that their actions were justified represents an ongoing danger to children. She sentenced Patricia to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. Frank received the same sentence. Both would be required to register as child abusers and were prohibited from unsupervised contact with minors. The defendants may have believed that their wealth and social standing would protect them from consequences, Judge Chen said. But in this courtroom, the only thing that matters is the evidence, and the evidence clearly shows that you deliberately harmed a helpless child. No amount of charitable giving or community service can excuse that behavior. As Patricia and Frank were led away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Satisfaction that justice had been served, sadness that it had come to this, and relief that Sophie would be protected from further harm. 6 months after the sentencing, Sophie was thriving. Her nightmares had stopped. Her appetite had returned to normal, and she was excelling in 1st grade. She still saw Dr. Williams occasionally, but mostly for routine check-ins, rather than intensive therapy. The case had changed our family in unexpected ways. David had grieved the loss of his parents, but emerged stronger and more protective. Our marriage had been tested by the crisis, but had ultimately been strengthened by our shared commitment to Sophie's well-being. My professional reputation had actually been enhanced by the case. Colleagues respected my willingness to apply the same standards to my own family that I applied to strangers' families. I'd received several commendations for my handling of the situation and had been asked to speak at conferences about recognizing abuse within families. Most importantly, Sophie had learned lessons that would serve her throughout her life. She'd learned that her voice mattered, that adults who hurt children face consequences, and that the people who truly love her will always protect her. One evening, as I was tucking her into bed, she asked me a question that revealed how much she'd grown. "Mama, if someone ever tries to hurt me again, what should I do?" "Tell me immediately," I said. "Tell Daddy, tell your teacher, tell any adult you trust. And remember that if one adult doesn't listen, you keep telling until someone does. Even if the person who hurts me is someone we're supposed to love? Especially then, baby girl. Love never includes hurting. Real love means protecting people, especially children." Sophie smiled and settled back into her pillow. "I'm glad you protected me, Mama. I will always protect you, sweetheart. That's what mamas are for." As I turned off her light and closed her door, I reflected on the journey we'd traveled together. It had started with the worst day of our lives, finding Sophie locked in that closet, dehydrated and terrified. But it had ended with our family stronger, safer, and more connected than ever before. Patricia and Frank had intended to break Sophie's spirit, to teach her that her needs didn't matter, and that adults could hurt her without consequences. Instead, they'd taught her that she was worth fighting for, that justice existed for everyone regardless of age, and that her parents would move heaven and earth to keep her safe. The woman they'd tried to intimidate and manipulate had turned out to be exactly the wrong person to test. They'd chosen to abuse the child of someone who'd devoted her career to protecting children from people exactly like them. Looking back, I realized that every case I'd worked, every training I'd attended, every skill I'd developed had been preparing me for the moment when I'd need to fight for my own daughter. All those years of advocating for other people's children had given me the tools I needed to save my own. Patricia and Frank were serving their sentences in separate facilities, their reputations destroyed, their social circles collapsed, their legacy permanently stained by their conviction for child abuse. They'd gambled everything on their ability to manipulate and control, and they'd lost completely. Sophie was sleeping peacefully in her own bed, safe and loved and protected. She'd faced challenges in her life, as every child does, but she'd face them with the knowledge that she deserved respect, safety, and unconditional love. The war was over. We'd won. And more importantly, Sophie had learned that sometimes the most important battles are the ones where someone who loves you refuses to back down, no matter how powerful the opposition might seem. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.